And before we introduce our topic, let me, of course, introduce our guests this evening. Dan Perry, former head of the Middle East and Europe divisions of the Associated Press, and the former chairman of the Foreign Press Association. We have a veteran journalist, currently senior correspondent for the Jewish Insider, Ruth Marks Eglash, and, of course, Carrie Keller-Lynn, political correspondent for the Times of Israel. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. And our topic is challenging tonight as we discuss the fallout or potential ramifications of the tragic death of our colleague Shireen Abu Akleh this morning in Jenin. So before we discuss, let's take a closer look.
A free and fair press is fundamental to democracies all over the world. Journalists providing the public with a vital window into truth and deception. The value and intentions of a reporter is what makes the death of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh all the more tragic. The Al Jazeera journalist was shot dead whilst reporting on clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinians in the West Bank city of Jenin. The Qatar-based network said she was shot by the IDF, but Israel's defense minister says that according to the initial investigation, no IDF shooting was identified. Israel has demanded an extensive investigation into the incident, but the Palestinian Authority has been quick to blame Israel and to decline it. The tragedy comes amid a surge in violence between Israel and Palestinians. But just how disruptive is this event for the process of peace? Could there be an investigation recognized by both sides? Will the death of this Palestinian journalist shake the region?
So before we begin our conversation, I would like to first extend our condolences to Shireen's family, and also stress that obviously it's a very sensitive topic. Many different versions are being thrown up in the air. So we are sticking to the facts. A journalist being killed whilst covering the IDF operation in the city of Jenin. This is what we know at this point in time. So let's begin. Will Shireen's death shake the region? You know the rules, dear panelists. You each get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance, and we pick up the debate after. So, Dan, please take the lead.
Well, will it shake the region? It certainly could if it turned out the tragedy was seen as a deliberate act by the IDF, but that's extremely unlikely. And at present, we do not even know who's responsible, as you say. Al Jazeera accuses Israel, but I haven't seen evidence of it. Moreover, if it was an accident caused by negligence, the chance of that negligence coming from the Palestinian militants is equal to or greater than the chances that it came from the IDF. But, you know, if bad faith players like Hamas want to exploit the tragedy and use it as an excuse to raise the level of the flames for some imagined benefit, that would certainly come as no surprise.
Yes, Carrie, what's your take on the issue?
It's already shook. It's been shook for 2 months. We're in the middle of a 2-month-long terror wave. It's gone from Jerusalem to Jenin. The reason why the IDF was in Jenin was to perform an operation to make arrests this morning. I think that, as Dan mentioned, the most important thing that is that despite the fact that the two narratives that have been circling today are both blame and demonization, both from the IDF, the Israeli government, and the Palestinian Authority, what has not been said is that this was a deliberate act. Everyone seems to recognize that this was an accident, although the question of who should be held to blame for it and to what extent is definitely still in question and will dictate what happens regionally.
Right, and last but definitely not least, Ruth.
Yeah, so I mean, I just today heard Benny Gantz, Defense Minister Gantz, speaking about the importance of investigation. And I really think if something is going to come out of this, that there'll be an investigation into what happened. And maybe we'll see for the first time the Palestinian Authority cooperating with Israel and handing over the bullet which killed Shireen. And then Israel will be able to determine what the facts are and what happened and how she was killed. So I think if something is going to come out of this, if something could shake the region, it could be a new approach I always like to be hopeful that something good can come out of something bad.
Yeah.
And maybe the sides will work together to find out what really happened. I mean, everyone understands how serious this is and what a terrible tragedy that someone was killed in the line of duty like this.
Yes. You know what, Ruth, we'll pick up from this point exactly, because my first question to you, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, as always, please feel free to interact, was the facts or the full picture is still vague, but my question to you is, does it matter? Because in the battle over narratives, if you will, it seems that Israel already lost to an extent, but you're saying it might be the other way around. There might be an opportunity here to create unity. Dan, what do you think?
Well, I think it depends. Israel's ham-handed treatment of the attack on the AP building last year was a masterclass in how not to do PR. I think what they did today was after the event was reasonable by calling for a joint investigation, and indeed, as was said, an autopsy and a look at the bullet would reveal pretty quickly what happened. Does it matter? I think this underscores that Israel's occupation of the West Bank is very toxic. Bad things are going to happen. Israel's going to always get blamed, and their pretense that they're not really responsible for what happens in the West Bank because A, there's terrorists here, and B, much of the population is under the Palestinian Authority for civilian purposes, and so Israel has deniability. None of that wins any sympathy around the world. And so to an extent, perceptions being what they are and people being as superficial as they can be, yeah, I agree. I mean, anything that happens in the West Bank that's bad is going to look bad for Israel. A more strategic government in Israel would be looking for ways to disentangle itself from the West Bank, because these tragedies are going to happen. And we're talking today about the tragic death of a journalist, but every death is a tragedy. And I don't see anything good happening in West Bank until a change is effected.
Carrie, any chance to dodge the battle of narratives?
I think that the battle of narratives has been the game that Israel and the Palestinian Authority have been engaged in now for years. The thing that was most swirling around me today was that this might become a second Mohammed al-Dura. If you remember, the young Palestinian boy who was accused of being shot by IDF, it later turned out that he was not, but it became a pursuing narrative. And that is why some ministers, including Justice Minister Gideon Sa'ar, went so far today to call this another blood libel. Language that I would argue is maybe a little bit strong and misplaced, especially given that we are dealing with the death of a professional in a setting in which you did not presumably expect to meet this end. But we do need to think about finding truth and maybe replacing the narrative of truth. And as Ruth mentioned, I think the way to do that is to actually be pursuing an investigation that's approved of by all sides.
So Ruth, maybe the only way, please, Dan. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, the fact that Palestinians are refusing a joint investigation, and as far as I know, we're refusing an autopsy, which would very clearly reveal which side's bullet killed the journalist, strongly suggests that they're not looking for the truth. Indeed, as was said, if they change their position and they help find out the truth, then that might be an opening to a new reality. But right now, one doesn't have to be too cynical to suspect that the Palestinians, not just the militants, but sadly the Palestinian Authority, seem to be trying to ensure that Israel will get blamed as opposed to looking for the truth. And that is very regrettable and quite bad sign. And I hope they change their position.
Well, even the Taliban is condemning it now. So political hijacking is no stranger, I would say, to these sorts of events. But perhaps, Ruth, the only way out here is indeed a third party to have an independent investigation on the matter. And let me just note that even if an investigation will find this or that side to, quote unquote, to be blamed, it does not mean it was intentional.
Right. Mm-hmm. I think it's been said already in the last few minutes that both sides are taking this. There's always going to be people who take this to their narrative and use it for their benefit, to whatever the political ideology that they want to push. So that's the sad reality of this conflict. But on the other hand, there have been efforts and there have been overtures with this government in the past 11 months that it's been in power. And we saw Benny Gantz meeting a few months ago with Abu Mazen and taking measures. I know for a fact, because I've been speaking with his team, that he has a clear agenda, that he understands there's no peace process on the horizon, and he's been making some goodwill gestures towards the Palestinians. And one of the things he spoke about today was using this mechanism, this relationship that he has with Abu Mazen, to convince them to come forward. And I don't think this was mentioned, that Shireen also was an American citizen,
right?
And I know that the Americans are getting involved in this. The U.S. ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, called for an investigation. The State Department said it needed to be investigated. So maybe it is time for the U.S. to step in and look at this. And because Shireen was such a high-profile person, and she was out doing her job, an important job that all of us here have been involved in at some point, maybe it could be a turning point in at least in situations like this. I mean, let's not get carried away, but at least these kind of situations.
But speaking to that point, we've all been covering clashes or violent uprisings on the ground. It is often dangerous, very chaotic, almost always. Dozens of journalists are being killed around the world every year while doing their job, while on duty, covering conflicts. Maybe it's not preventable. Maybe there's no one to blame in these instances, unless Danny will say harsher protocols are needed, as again in your previous role as chair of the Foreign Press Association. Excuse me.
Look, protocols sound good. It's always hard to argue with protocols and procedures, but I'm not really sure. There's always a trade-off between keeping journalists safe and enabling them to cover a war. The journalists themselves insist on access, and with that access comes risk. And this is something that as journalists, I think we, to a degree, have to accept, and we generally do. Journalists are not forced to go into war zones, and when they do, it's very courageous. And I mean, I'm proud of my former colleagues at AP and of Shireen for even being there. And it appears that today she just paid a terrible price in an unfortunate accident. No journalist should be targeted, but terrible accidents are difficult to avoid, unfortunately. More than anything, more than Mohammed Adora, by the way. This reminds me of the AP journalist Nazir Darwaza, who was killed about 20 years ago in the Second Intifada by a ricocheted bullet in a Kasbah in Nablus. The difference with Mohammed Adora, which was easily convertible into a PR coup against Israel, was that you had video of a little kid cowering for long minutes. So that was a much more difficult and weird situation. Here it was appears to have been a momentary shot gone astray by one of the two sons.
Yeah. And before we wrap up this part of our debate, do you think it can metastasize into a large-scale magnitude diplomatic crisis for Israel, Carrie?
I actually think that, it could have actually reverberated internally in Israel. I've spent the day in the Knesset today, and people were saying, had this incident happened not in Jenin but on the Temple Mount, that Israel's government might not be anymore today, because Israel's Islamist Arab Party Ram announced that it was coming back into the coalition today. Delayed announcement after the news that Shireen was killed broke. But had this happened on the Temple Mount, where it's inside of Israel, it's a highly tense scenario, very contested who should or shouldn't have a say over it. This could have broken up Israel's government, definitely had reverberated more so internationally.